have to click OK. And now I've got the pleasure of introducing our speaker this evening, Kevin Hofmann. Kevin, by the time he turned 2 years old, had survived an abortion, had been relinquished for adoption, adopted by a family of another race, and woke up to a burning cross in his front yard. Kevin was born in Detroit in August of 1967, 2 weeks after the riots that had changed that city forever. It was out of these amazing circumstances that his life began, and it's out of these experiences that he tells his story, a story of struggle and joy and pain and passion, and most of all, hope. I will be putting in the chat some links to Kevin's book, Growing Up Black and White, and some more information where you can learn more about Kevin as he gets started with us. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kevin. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So I will start at the most logical place, and then I'll kind of share with you the key lessons I've learned from being an adoptee growing up. But as Betsy mentioned, my story starts back in 1966, 67 in Detroit. My mother, so I'm the product of an affair between a white woman and black man. My mother was a white woman, about 5 feet tall, just over 100 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes. And before I came along, she had her family. She had 3 boys and a girl. And she became a mother when she was 17, still in school. She had a relationship with a young man whom she thought she was in love with. And when she shared the news of being pregnant, he vaporized and disappeared. So she was left, this young single mother, to raise her first, and at that time, her only son, Michael. Fortunately, her mother kind of rallied around her and helped my mother through the pregnancy, and then as well as, helped to raise this child. Unfortunately, my mother was given advice from her mother, which was, my mother's name is Helen. And the advice that her mother gave her was, you're going to have to hitch your train to the next thing coming, because this is in the 1950s, and no man is going to want to raise somebody else's child. So the first man that comes along that agrees to marry you, you need to take him up on that. And so unfortunately, my mother followed that advice, and she married her husband, Louis. And Louis felt himself to be a charitable individual, and never let my mother forget about this great deed he did for her. The deed was taking on her and her fatherless child. And so the relationship with my mother and Louis was a very tense relationship. My mother went on to have 2 more boys and then a girl. And like I said, her mother is who helped her with that first child especially. And that was, so in late 1966 or early 1967, my mother was hit with devastating news, which was that her mother, who was only in her 50s, tragically died, suddenly. And so my mother was left to grieve the loss of her mother. And she knew that she couldn't find that peace in her husband. Her husband just wasn't built that way. But she knew she could find some kind of solace in where she worked. My mother worked at the Chevy stamping plant, Livonia, Michigan. She worked in the cafeteria of the plant. And that's where she would go and kind of that was her place to exhale. I found it really interesting that my white mother, her best friend was this black woman. And often I can just imagine that when my white mother went into work, the white employees kind of motioned her over and said, Helen, you shouldn't be messing with those colored folk. And my mother's best friend, Lulu, was a black woman. And I'm sure the black people in the plant called Lulu over and was like, you can't trust them white folk. And despite of all that, my mother and Lulu had this very close relationship. When I met a biological sister years later, she referred to Lulu as Aunt Lulu. So Lulu was very close to the family. The only caveat was that because Lulu was black, she was not allowed in Helen's house. Louis, her husband, wouldn't allow that. And so they had this close relationship, and that's where she would go to find her peace, was at work. So 1967, it's the winter, beginning of 1967. My mother is mourning the loss of her mother, my grandmother, and she can't find any comfort in her husband. And she goes to work and she finds comfort in a coworker. And just when my mother doesn't think that winter could get any worse, she finds out she's pregnant. And panicked, she runs to her sister Nancy's house, which wasn't far away. And I talked to Nancy years later, and Nancy said, I could tell by the way your mother pounded on my mobile home door that something was wrong. And Nancy opens the door, and her older sister is down on the steps below her. And she welcomes her sister in, and she said, I could tell, as soon as I looked at her face, I knew something was wrong. So she asked my mother to come in, and they sit down over some lukewarm coffee at the mobile home kitchen table. And Nancy kind of hem-haws around, and then finally she said, I had to ask your mother what was wrong. I knew something was wrong. And I dreaded what her answer was going to be. And so she looks across the table and she says, Helen, what's wrong? And Helen had come there to get a loan. Because she was pregnant, Helen's plans were to get a loan from her sister and brother-in-law, take a 60-mile drive up to Flint, and have me aborted. And so, but she knew the collateral she was going to have to put down for the loan was going to have to come in the form of information. And like most of us, Helen didn't want her sister in her business. So she just wanted to give her as little information as she could to secure this loan. And so she started out and she said, Nancy, I need you and Ray's help. That was Nancy's husband. She said, I'm pregnant. And Nancy, who wasn't a big fan of Helen's husband, Louis, said, well, you and Louis both know where children come from. You're just going to have the child. And me and Ray will be an aunt and uncle again. That's great news. And then my mother came off more information and she said, well, you remember 8 years ago when we had our daughter? Louis said he didn't want to have any more children. He is not going to be happy that I'm pregnant. And Nancy still forges forward and she says, well, you know, that's just too bad. Louis is going to have to own up to his responsibility. And then my mother again comes off more information and she says, Nancy, remember 8 years ago when I had our daughter, Louis had an operation. He can't have children. And this still isn't clicking with Nancy. And so Nancy is still forging forward and she says, well, sometimes those operations don't take. And then Helen says, this child isn't Louis. And Nancy's response to that was, well, he won't know. Louis not the brightest bulb in the closet. Just tell him it's his. And then the final piece of information that my mother has to come up with is probably the information she dreaded the most. And she says, remember Pee-wee, the cook at work, the black cook at work? When this child comes out, even Louis will know it's not his. And with the truth behind that statement, it literally took the oxygen out of Nancy's lungs. She quietly got up from the kitchen table and disappeared into the back of the mobile home. She returned about 5 minutes later. She knelt down in front of her older sister and grabbed her hand. And in her hand, she put the money to have me aborted. And it was my mother's plan to leave this mobile home and travel the 60 cold miles to Flint, Michigan, and have me aborted. And I never met my mother, so I don't know what happened, but somewhere along those 60 miles, she changed her mind. And I look back on that time. This is 1967. I was born in August, 2 weeks after the riots in Detroit. So you have to, context is everything, especially when we talk about race and history. So this is in Detroit. A white woman is pregnant with a black man's child out of wedlock. And she has to go home to her white husband and tell him that she's pregnant by a black man. I'm sure, knowing full well that Louis could have responded in a number of different ways, some that may have included violence, and I doubt the police would have even been called. And so my mother goes home with the great courage that she had, and she explains to her husband that she had an affair with a black man and she's pregnant. And his caveat was, well, you can have the child, but you have to immediately give the child up for adoption. So my mother goes into the hospital in August. She has me. And from the hospital, she calls her best friend, Joanne, and she says, Joanne, I need your help. It's my responsibility to transport this child from the hospital to the foster home. And I can't bear to go on this ride alone with my husband. Would you and your husband come with us? And so Joanne had shared this with me many years later. She said, so it was my job to sit in the back seat, and I held you, and I tilted you in a way so that your mother could see you in her rearview mirror. She said, I did that the 5-minute trip to the foster home. We pulled up, and the whole time we're driving over to the foster home, Louis, your mother's husband, is yelling at her because he can't understand why she's crying. And they pull up in front of the foster home. My mother gets out and reaches into the back seat and grabs me and disappears into the foster home. And Joanne said my mother stayed in there for about 5-10 minutes and came out. And she said, this was the last time me and your mother ever spoke of you. She called me 2 weeks after that and asked me to come with her back to the foster home so she could drop off diapers and onesies for you. And it was pretty much the same thing. We pulled up to the front of the house. Your mother went in. 10 minutes later, she came back out, and we never talked about you again. I couldn't bear to bring that up to your mother because she was just so heartbroken about what happened. I stayed in that was my one and only foster home. I stayed in there for 3 months. And then I was adopted by a white minister, his wife, and they had 3 biological children. So I'm the youngest in that family as well. At that time, my parents lived in Dearborn, a suburb of Detroit, a very white suburb of Detroit. And that's when our problems began as a family. When I was about 11 months old, we woke up to a cross burning in our front yard. That was the community's way of kind of saying, hey, little black boy, welcome to our neighborhood. We stayed in that neighborhood for 3 years. All the while I was referred to, my father was an associate pastor at the local Lutheran church. And when I went into the nursery on Sundays, they referred to me as the snotty-nosed black kid. My mother was refused services to get her hair done because she was with the black child. When we went to get family pictures, the photographer asked my mother if the family pictures should include me, the welfare baby. And after living in that kind of hostile environment, my parents decided to move. Where we moved 6 miles away into Detroit, into a black neighborhood. And from age 3 to 18, I was always surrounded by people that looked like me. And that was life-changing for me. The kids in that first black neighborhood became my superheroes. I wanted to be like them. I imitated them. I did everything I could to cling to them. And I can tell you at 3 years old, I had a feeling of home being in that community. And that was probably the best thing my adoptive parents did, was they had enough foresight to understand that culture and race are important and that I had to be part of my culture and my race. And they knew they couldn't teach it to me. So I was fortunate where I got to grow up in Detroit. The schools that I went to, and this was mainly because, it was right after the riots in Detroit. And so
Kevin, you're muted.
Kevin, somehow you got muted.
Sorry, I don't know why that came on. But I grew up in a black neighborhood and then went to schools that were 95, 98% black. And that was important for me, trying to figure out who I was racially. And there were so many lessons I learned from growing up that way. Probably the biggest lesson I learned as an adoptee and growing up was the importance of talking about that. My parents shared with me that when they went to pick me up from the adoption agency, they were told, don't talk to them about adoption, just pretend like you never adopted. And so we didn't talk about adoption. We didn't talk about race, which is like crazy advice to give a transracial family because I knew I didn't match my family. But we never talked about it. So the only time we talked about it was when usually little white kids would come up and they would see our family and they would wonder, why was this kid so much darker than everybody else? And so they would ask, when the parents left, I swear this conversation went verbatim. They would say to my brothers, as if I wasn't there, which as an adoptee drove me crazy. So they would have this conversation about me, around me, but not with me. And so they would say to my brothers, he's your brother? And they'd say, yeah, he was adopted. And then the young child would ask, well, what happened to his real mom? And then my brothers would answer, she couldn't afford to keep him, so she gave him away. And that never made sense to me. To this day, that doesn't make sense to me because I had friends that I grew up with whose parents couldn't take care of them, but they didn't give them away. And so that was the biggest lesson I learned. I look back now, man, we should have had these deep conversations. We should have talked about the fact that I was adopted and that I thought about my biological mother all the time. This tells you how much I thought about her, where I had created in my head who my biological mother was. And so I've always been really creative. So in my head, my mother was this woman that spoke with an English accent, and she was rich. And she was descendant somehow from royalty. And I didn't know my mother was white until I was in my 20s. So very rich, creative mind going on here, which tells you that I thought a lot about my mother, but I never had anyone to share that with. It was funny, a couple of years ago, I went out to dinner with a fellow adoptee and I shared that story with her. And she said, that's what we do as adoptees. We fill in the blank. So she said, so here's my birth story. She said, I've always been afraid to meet my birth mother because in my head, my birth mother was going to come back and want to take my kidney. And I thought, man, what was going on in our heads was very similar. Like since nobody was speaking to us, we were speaking to ourselves and trying to make sense out of something that was very illogical to a little child. And that was one of the biggest lessons I learned was the necessity to talk about that. There was a necessity for me to have some connection with my biological family. And the tragic thing about that is, as an adoptee, I grew up thinking I was less than because my own mother didn't want me. And what a better storyline would have been, which was, your mother risked her life to have you. And that's in your DNA. The courage that your mother had to go back to her white husband and tell him she had an affair, that's in your DNA. And I wish someone would have shared that with me because that would have made me walk taller. And tragically, that was never shared. The other thing that we didn't talk about that was so important for me was race. We didn't talk about race or the impact of it. Now, my parents moved me to be part of that culture, but I have these racial gaps because I didn't grow up totally in it. And so my Black friends who grew up in Black households, they just knew so much more about that experience than I did. And so I wish someone would have kind of taught me about that DNA that I came from royalty, from, Africa, and that we were kings and queens back there. And I think that would have just helped to build me up. And those were the three biggest. And then the fourth lesson I learned, which was important to understand, was that we all have what I call adoptee residue, which is the stuff that comes with adoption that doesn't simply wash off. It's not as easy as that Lutheran Social Services told my parents, which was just ignore it and it'll go away. It doesn't go away. And so because of that, because my mother gave me up and I kind of grew up, I grew up really suffering, with my self-esteem and my worth, that relationships were very hard for me growing up. Peer relationships, especially dating, those were very, very tough relationships. And I look back on it now and I can tell you, I was doing what I could to fill the Helen-sized hole in my heart. And so I was dating women I never should have dated. Those relationships lasted way longer than they should have, but I was just so afraid to be alone. And I needed people to validate that I was worthy. And so it was very tough for me, especially when I was younger in my teens and young 20s. Rarely did I have a faithful relationship because I was always afraid that sure enough, someone's going to leave me. And so I've got to find someone else before that person leaves me. And so that was the biggest part of what I call that adoptee residue, that stuff that just sticks to you. Relationships were hard. Work relationships were hard. I had several jobs that, I graduated from college, got a job at Allstate Insurance Company. I was moving up pretty quickly. And then and then looking back on it, this was done very purposely, but I would enact the self-destruct button. And so I was so afraid to succeed because I didn't feel I was worthy. And so I would do stupid things to just sabotage my career. So sure enough, I said the wrong thing to the wrong person in power at Allstate, and it ended my career. I did the same thing at Nationwide. And that was just a pattern with me. And that was just that self-destructive behavior. And that, again, was the big part of that adoptee residue, that stuff that sticks to you. And again, it boils down to that big lesson that growing up, my parents, they didn't have this information back 54 years ago. But we should have talked about it more. I mean, what I had gone through, although I think people looked at it like, well, he was never with his mother and he was only in care for 3 months, so he should be fine. And there were just things that I still struggle with to this day that came a result of that. And those were really the lessons I learned. Betsy mentioned I wrote a book. That book was just very empowering for me because it allowed me to kind of put down my thoughts as to what happened and then to look back on those things and say, I think this is what was going on then. That was very healthy for me to do. And I've been fortunate where I can go and speak and it's free therapy. I mean, I get to talk about this stuff. I love when people ask me questions because then it makes me think about how I was impacted by this. And that's one of my big lessons when I go out and speak is that, adoption isn't this thing that happens many years ago and the kids are resilient and they get through it and they're never affected by it again. No, it stays with you the rest of your life. And I just wish, so one of the lessons I learned, so when I was growing up, I went to, like I said, a predominantly Black grade school. And one of my favorite teacher was my English teacher. And I think she understood the way society saw us as Black children. And so her job was to build us up as much as she could. And I didn't realize it at the time, but she was my 7th grade English teacher. And she brought in a course that she's taught for years and years on mythology, but it was 12th grade high school mythology. And looking back on that, what she was doing was showing us that we were smarter than we thought we were. And so I still remember all those stories of mythology, and the stories that I usually link into when I speak is the story of Achilles. And if you don't know the story of Achilles, Achilles is half mortal, half God. And he comes down to earth. He's born to his mortal mother, and she goes to the prophets and she asks them about her son. What's his future going to be? And they tell her he's going to die in battle. And so, as any mother would do, she does whatever she can, whatever she could to protect her child. And so what she does is she dips him in the river Styx, which was supposed to have these magic properties, was supposed to be able to protect you. So she dips him, she grabs him by his heels and dips him headfirst into the river Styx, but his heels don't get protected. And so sure enough, the prophecy comes true and he dies in the war, in the Trojan War. And he dies because he's hit in the heel with an arrow. And one of the things when I tell the story of growing up an adoptee and the lessons I've learned is, I just hope that, you know, I look back at that mother, Achilles' mother, and I'm sure she would have killed for a pair of steel-toed Jordans. And just like any mother and all of us, you just want to know where the threats are coming from. And if the mother couldn't have those steel-heeled Jordans, she would have rather just known which direction is this arrow coming from? Where are they going to be impacted by this? Or he going to be impacted by this? And that's one of the lessons I teach, is that my story may not speak to all adoptees or all adoptive families, but if I can somehow kind of point you in the direction where the threats may come, maybe that will help. And so that's what I hope I can do, is just, if you haven't kind of dive deep into some of these issues. I've spoke to a lot of adoptees in the past, and it's interesting how when I say, yeah, I was affected in this way, a lot of us will go, yeah, that self-destructive behavior, yeah, that self-sabotage, I do that all the time. So I hope this helps. And that's really what I've learned from this crazy life growing up as an adoptee. Any questions?
Thank you, Kevin. There are a few questions, actually. So one person asked early on, when you mentioned about your brothers, how did your brothers adapt to relocating to a Black community?
At the time, I thought fine. Throughout life, not so fine. So they were the minorities in that neighborhood and all the schools we went to. And that has created some resentment in our family. I think my brothers would have rather gone to the private, all-white schools in the suburbs of Detroit. And so I kind of think they did the math and they think, well, if we didn't have this Black kid in the family, maybe we could afford those schools. That wasn't true. My parents didn't make a lot of money. And so, yeah, there's a lot of tension in our family because I think several thought they were forced to grow up in a way that they didn't want to. And I think as children, it was a very lonely time for them too. They didn't really have people who could identify with the world. They didn't have anyone to kind of bounce off their world experience with.
Mm-hmm. So basically what you would have experienced had your family not moved.
Yes, exactly. But it's interesting because my sister is fine with it. My sister took it very positively, enjoyed the experience of getting to know, life, with the minority and how, the things are, and the inequality that comes with that.
Mm-hmm. Were you accepted? I've talked to some biracial people that don't feel like they were fully accepted in the Black community either, because maybe they looked different, or was that an issue? And I heard you say that you didn't know that you were biracial until you were a young adult.
Yeah, I didn't know. And Detroit was so interesting at that time where it was literally black or white. Those were the two sides. I remember I had a good friend that I played soccer with, and he was Filipino. And me and two other Black kids called him over and we're like, Gilbert, come here. We're going to say you're Black. You're with us. That was how clearly the racial lines were drawn in Detroit in the 70s, right after the riots. Detroit's racial history is very interesting. And so there was a Black community and a white community as far as I was concerned. I understood for my survival, my social survival, I was going to have to find a way to adhere and stick to the Black community because I knew I wouldn't pass as a white kid. And I knew the differences early on. I knew that very clearly. And so, yeah, there was a lot of energy put into really studying my Black friends and studying Black culture because I did not want to be rejected by that culture. And I took so much joy in the richness of the culture. And so, yeah, I remember just sitting there watching and how, my friends would respond to certain things and really just imitating that for so long.
Mm-hmm. How much did your parents know about your background? Did they know that you were biracial and just didn't share that, or they weren't told much, or what? If you don't mind sharing.
So when I started looking for my biological mother, I was in college. And I remember calling, I felt like, let me be the good adoptee and call mom and dad and let them know I'm going to start this search. So I did, and they were cool with it. And I'm 20 years old at this time, and we've never talked about this before. And my dad says, oh, well, that's great. Here, her last name is Purvine. And then goes on to tell me all this information that he had for the last 20 years, but he never shared it with me. And I think he made the mistake a lot of adoptive parents make, which is, well, when Kevin's ready to talk about this deeply emotional stuff that adults can't even talk about, he'll come to us and ask us about it. And when he asks, then I'm going to open up this treasure. And so it was, so 40 some years later, when I did find my mother, my biological mother in the family, it was because my father remembered her last name. I never would have found her without that last name. It would have been possible.
But did he know her race?
He probably did. Yeah, Purvine. So he would have known.
Yeah.
But no, so we didn't know. I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know that I was biracial until I got the non-identifying information from the adoption agency.
Yeah, I would say that's a pretty common experience from, our generation, at least. Maybe
Exactly.
Hopefully not so much now, but well, thanks for sharing. We did have a couple questions about searching. If you'd like to share about your birth family, it sounds like you never met your birth mother. Somebody's also asking about whether or not you met your birth father.
Yeah, so started the search when I was 20, before the internet, searched on and off. I get totally exhausted, totally pissed off about the whole process and all the information they're keeping from me. And so I get burned out and I'd stop for 2 or 3 years. So I did that on and off for 20 some years. Mm-hmm. Then I had just written the book. I was getting in touch with the adoption community. An adult adoptee suggested I try using a search angel to find my mother. And so one October night, I was going with my teenage boys out to a high school football game. And I sent the adoption angel my non-identifying information. And within 20 minutes, using the internet, she found my mother. And that night I sat on these cold metal football stands and I read the email from the adoption angel that told me my mother had passed away 6 years before that. And that night, sitting in those stands, the adoption angel was good. She got a picture of my mother's headstone, the obituary, and then the names of my biological brothers and sister. And then the search began on trying to connect with them. And let me say that throughout the 20 years that I was searching on and off, it gave me the time to come up with every kind of scenario. So I was prepared for the fact that my mother might be dead. She was 30 when I was born, so she would have been in her 70s. I had prepared myself for that possibility. And this sounds horrible to say, but it's honest. Part of me was relieved that she wasn't alive because I don't know if I could have handled the emotion of meeting her in person. And so I began the search to find brothers and sisters, her children. and came dead end, dead end, dead end. Tried phone numbers, they all came back disconnected, wrong. The last phone number I had was my mother's phone number to the house where she lived with Louis. And I called the phone number as a last resort. And to my surprise, Louis answered the phone. And I hadn't thought this out too well, because it's really not easy to ask a guy, yeah, I know your wife had an affair. I'm her child. Could you help me? And so I kind of blurted out, I have reason to believe your wife was my biological mother. Do you know anything about that? Do you remember anything about that? As if he would have forgot. And he stops me and says, hold on, you need to talk to my wife. And now I'm totally confused because I'm like, how did I get this wrong? I saw her headstone, I saw her obituary. And this woman gets on the phone. And so then I got to go through, this is so grueling for adoptees where you got to go through the whole story all over again with everybody. So I go through the story with her again. And then in the background, I hear him say, oh, you mean my first wife? And so then he gets back on the phone and there's this long pause. And I can feel what he's thinking. And what he's thinking is, oh my God, I have to tell this young man his mother's dead. And so he says, well, she passed away. And I said, yeah, I know. I was hoping I was bold at this point. I said, I was hoping you could give me some information about my biological father. And he says, well, she went to a party and got knocked up by some colored guy. And one of the things I've learned as an adoptee is you got to be willing to take those punches, because that could be the only string between you connecting with other people. And so I kind of just braced myself and took that one on the chin. And he says, well, I don't remember anything else about that, but if anybody would, it would be her friend. She had a good friend. That's Lulu. He says, I can't remember her name, but I know her number is in your mother's phone book. I'll check the phone book and I'll get you her number. And he's like, okay, give your contact information to my wife, my new wife. And so the wife gets on the phone. I'm going through what I need to give her. And she goes, oh, well, your sister's been looking for you. And quite honestly, I had thought, again, I had 20 years to think about all this stuff. I had come to the conclusion that my brothers and sisters probably didn't know about me, or they were told. They were all much older than me. So I had a sister that was 8 years older than me, and I had a brother that was 15 years older than me. So a 15-year-old knows what being pregnant is. An 8-year-old knows what being pregnant is. But I had assumed, what's the logical story to tell a child if you're pregnant and then you don't come home with the baby? You just tell them the baby died. And I assumed that's what my sister was told. So I was speechless when the new wife says, well, your sister's been looking for you. And so that was the Sunday before Thanksgiving, 2009. That next day, my sister called me. And my sister still lives up in the Detroit area. I live in Toledo. My sister married a guy that lived 10 minutes from me. And she was literally going to be going past my house to go down and visit his family in 3 days at Thanksgiving. And so my sister stopped by. And that was the first time I ever saw anyone that looked like me. And I learned too that I would not have fared well in Louis's house. My older brother was an alcoholic and drug addict, primarily because of the treatment that he received from Louis. Louis never let him forget he wasn't his son. And I was a even worse reminder of that. So I would have been treated horribly in that family. And so, shortly after I connected with the family, my older brother, Michael, passed away from his addictions. And and this is an adoptee story for you. So I get it. I get told about it through Facebook. So one of my mother's friends, the one that held me in the car, I connected with her, and I, out of the blue, one day on Facebook, I get a message that says, "Did you know Michael died?" And I had been in touch with my sister and a brother and a niece. And it was just kind of that reminder that you're part of the family, but not part of the family. And that began really the unraveling of my desire to want to be connected with the family. I pulled back shortly after that, and just for the first time in my life as an adoptee, chose to protect myself. And so really didn't have much contact. They're there. You know, I have a niece that I'll connect with every now and then. But here's kind of a cool story. When I did connect with the family, I connected with an uncle, Uncle Harold. And he sent me pictures of my mother through the mail 10 years ago. 2 years ago, I go out to the mailbox at Christmas, and there's a Christmas card in there. So I go inside, and I'm standing with my wife, and the address is California. I didn't recognize it. So I open it up, and it's a Christmas card. But when I open up the letter, a check falls out. And there's a check in there from my Uncle Harold, who I've never talked to, for $5,000. And I was just totally floored. And so I go to, like I said, I'm in touch with a niece, and the niece is kind of the hub of their family. So I messaged the niece on Facebook, and I'm like, "Did your dad or your aunt get a letter from Uncle Harold?" And she goes, "No, I don't think so." And I don't know who got a check or why. And I didn't want to put it out there that I'd gotten one, because I didn't know how they were going to respond to that. Because my fear was I got one and they didn't, and that was going to cause a problem. And so I talked to Stephanie, my niece, and I said, "Do you have Harold's number? I'd like to call him." So I call him, and I go, "Well, I got your letter." And I said, "First of all, I just want to thank you, because more than the check." And so he goes on to explain. He says, "Let me explain to you why I did that." And he says, "Last year, my wife died, and we settled up her affairs. I wanted to do that before I passed away. So I wanted to give all my nieces and nephews and children." He just wanted to dole out his inheritance while he was still alive. And he only included his children and his nieces and nephews. And I said, "I just want you to know that more than the check itself, the fact that you consider me part of the family, that means a lot." And I was also thinking, and if anybody else finds out about this, they're not going to be too happy, because I took some of their pot. But I thought it was kind of this full circle moment that I'd gotten with her family. And that he just recognized me as, I was his grandson, even though we never met. So that's the whole search.
Yeah, thanks. So Kevin, when you were talking, I wondered this, and then there's another question that is kind of along the same line. So obviously feel free not to disclose anything you don't want to, but you talked about your difficulty in relationships and you're sabotaging yourself at work and that type of thing. How did you transform that, or did you transform that? And then the follow-up question from someone else was, so this is very straightforward. Do you find it hard to tell the truth? I have experience with an adopted person that tells me what they believe I want to hear, not necessarily the truth. Would you challenge that situation? What would you recommend?
I don't have trouble telling the truth, but I do have trouble. Yeah, like people pleasing is a big thing. Yeah. So that has always been, part of that adoptee residue. And what was the first part?
Well, the first part was kind of my question of how did you transform how you handle relationships or those self-sabotaging behaviors? Or have you?
I ebb and flow. I mean, there are sometimes, this is one thing I did which really helped me, and my wife taught me this, which was, one, you don't have to be a people pleaser all the time. And so you are allowed to kind of protect yourself. And so, again, like I said, in the past, I was in relationships I never should have been in, and that not only dating, but in pure relationships. So, and I had the need growing up to have a huge circle. And as I got older, I just understood that, no, how about you just keep a couple people close that you can trust? That's probably safer for me. So I think I've changed that. I try to pay attention to when there are some times where I'm just not in the mood to people. And so I try to pay attention to that. But just being cognizant of the fact that relationships are a struggle, just knowing that's back there, it helps me to avoid that. And so there are times where I'm like, okay, you got to push through this. Because, yeah, so I just recently got a job, and I've never had anxiety before. And the anxiety came about, I think, because I was on the cusp of doing a job I've wanted for the last 12 years. And it was freaking me out. Like, my anxiety went through the roof. I mean, I had a panic attack, and I think it was that old voice saying, you're not worthy, you're not good enough. So it still comes and goes, and man, it's found different ways to show itself, unfortunately. But being cognizant of that and understanding that's kind of my cycle, yeah, I try to really see that when it's there and then push through it as much as I can.
So I think the essence of the second part of that question about telling people what they want to hear, and you know, identify that as people pleasing, you know, and each person's different. So this might or might not be the answer for the person the other person's in a relationship with, but would it work for you if somebody kind of called you out on that and asked you to be more real when you were doing that?
When I was doing what?
People pleasing.
Would that have helped? No, not me. Because that would have just made me mad.
So you would have
and I was very sensitive, and still am. Like, so that would have hurt me, and I would not have been able to see the benefit of that for quite a while, I don't think. So I don't think that would have helped me at all. I would have taken that as rejection, quite honestly.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing. I hope that's helpful to the person who's working with that and, you know, in her world. So we have time maybe for one last question. Oh, you know, there was a question about when you were talking about searching. So are you willing to share about your birth father? Did you connect?
Oh yeah. So I always thought about my mother. And this kind of goes deep, but so I asked myself recently, well, how come you never really, I fantasized about who my mother was, but not so much my father. And my answer to that lately, that could change tomorrow, was, I think I bought into the con that Black children in the relationship with fathers isn't there anyway. And so I dismissed that as being unimportant. But I have searched for my father. And actually, as I got older, that relationship became more and more important because I wanted to connect to the Black side. And I had all these pictures of, if you've ever seen the movie Antoine Fisher, and when he meets the family, that I was fantasizing about that. This big, they'd set out this feast for me and welcome me in. And so, but this was so frustrating for me. So when I would search for my white mother and her family, all kinds of records came back. I was able to trace them back to when they came into America. The furthest I got back from my father was his parents, so my grandparents. And that was it. It was like they disappeared, which is a huge lesson for us in this country, that we keep records totally different for white people versus people of color. And that was so frustrating for me that I couldn't even find grandparents' information. And I knew my father had kids, and I couldn't find the kids. And how I found my biological father was really by chance. I took a DNA test. I went through 23andMe and I went through Ancestry. I went through 23andMe first, and then I thought years later I went and did Ancestry. And out of the blue one day, a couple years after I did it, I got a message from someone saying, "I think I'm your brother." And he had the same name as my father. My father's name was Lawrence Nelson. And this guy, yeah, his name was Lawrence Nelson. And I was so confused because then he started giving me names of people, but they weren't people that I had come across. And so finally we unraveled it, and he's actually my brother's son. So my father had a child, Lawrence Nelson Jr., and then he had a child, Lawrence Nelson.
Mm-hmm.
And so I met my nephew, and it was interesting because my father had this relationship with this woman, had no idea that a child resulted in it. So he had nothing about me. He had a child, that child had a son, and he disappeared. So it's kind of generational in our family, like 3 generations of men having relationships and not being around for the children. And so I met Lawrence Nelson, my brother, Christmas a couple years ago. And I call him, I get the number from my nephew and I call him, and he's 20 years older than me. So at the time he was in his early 70s. And your typical old, cool Black dude. And I called him and he didn't answer. So I left him a message and I gave him as much information as I could about what I knew of the family. And within 5 minutes, he called me back. But then at that time, I was too freaked out to answer the phone. So I let it go to voicemail. And on the voicemail, he goes, "Hofmann, this is Lawrence. Yep, we're brothers. Call me." And so I call him and talk, man, he would be a great poker player because he didn't come off any information. And I said, "Yeah, did you know about me?" He's like, "Nope." And I said, "Do you have siblings?" And I knew we have a sister. And he goes, "Yeah, I got a sister. She gets along better than I do." Didn't give me her name, nothing. And I ended the conversation by just saying, "Well, if you could pass my name and number on to your sister, I'd love to talk to her." Because I was hoping I could get a deeper emotional connection with, quite honestly, with the sister. But I don't know if he ever did or what happened, but she never called me. I followed up with him once. Yeah, and so yeah, that was kind of tough because I never got to connect with that family. But as suspected, they had no idea I was out here.
Thanks for sharing that. At the risk of going over, we had an interesting question that we'll need a brief answer to because it is 9 o'clock. But somebody asked, when do you feel safe?
That's a great question. The job so I do a lot of, it's a great question for the line of work I do. So I do a lot of work in diversity and inclusion. So we talk about that question all the time. And honestly, I'm now the director of a department in diversity, but I'm with a group who has a heart for social justice. So I feel home there because I can bring my full self to work. And I can share the tragic thing, of the grocery store that was just shot up and Black people were targeted. Like I can share that at work now because that's a safe place. So that's where I feel safe with my family. It's honest, but it's not the best thing to say. But I feel safe around people that experience the world as I do. So, and that, quite honestly, that's people who are liberal minded and people of color, where they understand that there's inequalities in society, and I can share that with them and they can simply go, "Yeah, you're right," or "Yeah, that's messed up," and we can move on and I don't have to debate them over it. And so that's where I feel, those places are where I feel safe.
Good. I'm really glad that you've been able to create that for yourself. That's wonderful. So thank you for sharing so openly this evening. You've kind of laid it all out there. We really appreciate that. So for everybody who was here this evening, I did put a link to a quick survey just so that we can get your feedback about the evening and what other topics you might be interested in and that type of thing. I also put a link to our search program and our program calendar. So we've got lots of resources for everyone, and you can check those out. If you're not familiar with the Adoption Network Cleveland, we are a nonprofit organization, and we ask for you to consider joining us. That helps us to continue to be here and to meet your needs. And we hope to see you soon at one of our programs. And Kevin, thank you so much. I really appreciate how much you shared, and I'm sure that the audience resonated with it. So
Thank you. It's good to be here.
thanks everybody, and have a good rest of your evening. Good night.